6:42 a.m. The top floor of a silent glass skyscraper. The city below is just waking up. Daniel Brooks, a 41-year-old project manager and single father, steps off the elevator, coffee in hand. He passes the main boardroom. He stops. A sound, faint, like a broken whisper. Through the ajar door, he sees her, Claire Donovan, the famously cold CEO, the ice queen who never blinks. She is sitting alone, head in her hands, weeping quietly. Daniel turns to leave, but she looks up. Her eyes are red, raw. She says one sentence that changes everything. "Daniel, can you be my date today?" Watch him. Daniel Brooks was a man of steel and silence. At 41, his life was a carefully balanced equation, a masterpiece of routine designed to protect the only thing that mattered to him. He was a senior project manager in the product development wing of Donovan Tech, a position he had held for 4 years. In an industry fueled by screaming egos, backstabbing politics, and late-night posturing, Daniel was the quiet constant. He was the one who arrived early, finished his work with surgical precision, and vanished the moment the clock hit 5. He didn't participate in the hustle culture, LinkedIn rants, or the forced corporate retreats. He just did his job, and he did it better than anyone else. To his younger colleagues, Daniel was a mystery. They saw a man in simple, ironed, button-down shirts who didn't attend the Friday night happy hours or care about the latest corporate gossip. They assumed he lacked ambition because he never fought for a larger bonus or a corner office. They didn't see the man who spent his evenings on the living room floor building cardboard castles or patiently helping with long division. They didn't see the man who had learned that the most important milestones weren't tracked on a Gantt chart, but on the height marks drawn in pencil against a kitchen doorframe. Daniel was a single father to 10-year-old Emma. 3 years ago, his world had been hollowed out when his wife, Sarah, passed away after a short, aggressive battle with illness. Since that day, Daniel had systematically dismantled his old high-pressure life. He had been a rising star in a rival firm, a man who lived for the adrenaline of the deal. But the day Sarah died, the colors of the corporate world turned to gray. He walked away from the 60-hour weeks and the international flights. He chose Donovan Tech specifically because the role was stable and the location was 5 minutes from Emma's school. He needed to be the father who was there for the science projects, the bad dreams, and the Saturday morning pancakes. He didn't need a title on a door. He needed to be a hero in a small, warm apartment. Claire Donovan, on the other hand, was the face of the company's absolute dominance. At 37, she was widely regarded as a machine. She was brilliant, surgically decisive, and notoriously cold. She had inherited the company from her father, a man who believed that a CEO's only true friend was a healthy stock price. In the boardrooms of New York and London, she was known as the Ice Queen, a leader who could cut through a multi-million-dollar failure with a single icy stare. Her employees respected her, feared her, but never really knew her. In their eyes, Claire Donovan didn't have feelings. She had quarterly projections and a legacy to maintain at any cost. This morning was supposed to be routine. Daniel had come in early to prepare the final data points for the quarterly review meeting. The hallways were dim, smelling of industrial floor wax and the faint electrical ozone of the server rooms. He hadn't expected to see a light on in the main boardroom. He certainly hadn't expected to hear the sound of a human heart breaking in the dark. He had paused by the heavy mahogany door, his hand tightening on his paper coffee cup. Through the gap, he saw her. The powerful CEO was slumped in her chair, her back to the window, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. It was an image so jarring it felt like a glitch in reality. Daniel's first instinct was to walk away, to grant her the dignity of her privacy. He knew that for a woman like Claire, being seen in this state was a vulnerability she might never forgive. He turned his heel to leave, but his shoe caught the metal track of the sliding door. The floorboards creaked. Claire's head snapped up. Her makeup was ruined, her eyes bloodshot, and her breathing was a mess of hitches. But even in her grief, she held a remnant of that fierce, habitual authority. She looked at Daniel, standing there in his simple shirt, and the silence stretched between them for a heavy heartbeat. Then her voice broke the air. Not with a command, but with a desperate sudden plea that sounded like a child lost in a storm. Claire reached for a tissue, her movements frantic and clumsy as she tried to reconstruct the mask that had served her so well for a decade. I, I apologize, Mr. Brooks, she stammered, her breath still hitching. I didn't think anyone would be in before 7. Please, forget you saw this. Go back to your desk and prepare the integration report. Daniel didn't move. He didn't look away, but he didn't stare either. He looked at her with the same steady, non-judgmental gaze he used when Emma fell and scraped her knee on the pavement. I can go, Claire, he said, his voice a low, grounding baritone. But I have a feeling that if I do, you'll just keep sitting here until the board arrives. Sometimes, it's easier to breathe when someone is just standing nearby, not asking for anything. He walked to the coffee station in the corner of the room, poured a fresh cup, and set it on the table near her. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't offer a platitude about things getting better. He simply stood there, an anchor in her sudden storm. Claire looked at the steam rising from the cup. She let out a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to drain the last of her energy. Today is the investor gala, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. The biggest night of the year. The media, the board, the rivals. They'll all be there. And I was supposed to show up with my fiancé. She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the glass walls. We had a fight an hour ago. He told me I was too much of a CEO and not enough of a woman. He said I was as cold as the building I work in. He canceled the plans and walked out. He's probably halfway to the airport by now. She looked up at the ceiling, trying to keep the tears from falling again. If I show up alone, the rumors start. They'll say I'm unstable. They'll say the engagement was a PR stunt. In this world, optics are the only truth. And right now, my optics are a disaster. I feel like I'm falling, Daniel. Daniel listened. He thought about the world she lived in, a world of sharks and mirrors where showing a single crack meant being devoured. He thought about how exhausting it must be to never be allowed to have a bad day, to always have to be a statue. You're thinking about your image, Daniel noted quietly. But I think you're actually worried about the walk from the car to the door. Standing in a room full of people who want you to fail, that's a lonely place to be when you're hurting inside. Claire looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time in 4 years. She saw a man who wasn't intimidated by her power or her bank account. She saw a man who had seen real pain and come out the other side with his soul intact. She saw the invisible manager who always stayed calm when the servers crashed. "Be my date today," Claire said. The words hung in the air, heavy and absurd. Daniel blinked, his coffee cup pausing halfway to his lips. "Excuse me?" "I'm serious," Claire said, her voice gaining a hint of its usual steel, though the edges were still frayed. "Not as a romantic gesture, as a shield. I need someone who won't talk to the press. Someone who won't try to use the moment to climb the corporate ladder. I've watched you in the meetings, Daniel. You say less than anyone, but you see more. You're the only person in this building I trust not to make this awkward. Just for the event. One night. Please, I'm not asking as your boss. I'm asking as a person." Daniel thought about his evening. He had promised Emma they would watch a movie and eat popcorn. He thought about the tuxedo he hadn't worn since his own wedding. He thought about the thousands of eyes that would be on them. "I'm just a project manager, Claire," Daniel replied. "I don't belong at an investor gala with a $1,000 plate. I'm a dad who makes grilled cheese at 6 p.m. and goes to bed by 10. That's exactly why I need you," she countered, her eyes pleading. "Because you don't belong there. You're the only real thing in my life right now. Emma, your daughter, she's staying with your sister tonight, isn't she? You mentioned it in the hall yesterday while you were on the phone." Daniel was surprised she remembered such a small detail. He realized that beneath the Ice Queen exterior, she had been paying attention to the silence as much as he had. He looked at her ruined makeup and her trembling hands. He realized that this wasn't a CEO asking for a favor. It was a person asking not to be alone in the dark. "All right," Daniel said, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "Just for tonight. But I'm leaving by 10 p.m. sharp. I have a promise to keep to a 10-year-old girl." Claire smiled for the first time that day. It wasn't a corporate smile. It was a look of pure, unadulterated relief. 10 p.m. Deal. The transformation began at 4 p.m. Claire had arranged for a high-end tailor to meet Daniel at his apartment. They worked in the small living room, squeezed between Lego sets and stacks of school books. The contrast was surreal, the finest Italian wool being fitted in a room that smelled of crayons and laundry detergent. Daniel felt like an interloper in his own home. He looked at the photo of Sarah on the mantelpiece, and for a second, he thought he saw her wink. Daniel looked at himself in the mirror. The tuxedo fit perfectly, erasing the invisible dad and replacing him with a man who looked like he belonged on the cover of a global finance magazine. He felt deeply uncomfortable, like he was wearing a heavy costume. He was relieved when the doorbell finally rang. The black sedan was waiting downstairs. Claire was already inside, illuminated by the soft amber light of the interior. When Daniel stepped in, the air in the car seemed to vibrate with a high-frequency tension. She was wearing a floor-length emerald silk dress that made her look like a gemstone. Her hair was perfect, her makeup flawless. The Ice Queen was back, but Daniel could still see the faint, stubborn puffiness around her eyes. He could feel her heart racing through the seat. "You look remarkable, Daniel," Claire said, her voice steady but her fingers tightly interlaced. "I look like I'm about to break something expensive," Daniel joked, trying to ease the pressure. "How are you holding up? The armor feels heavy?" "I'm a machine, remember?" she replied, though her voice wavered slightly as the car turned toward the city center. "I've practiced my speech. I've reviewed the guest list. I'm ready to perform." As they pulled up to the Grand Regency Hotel, the flashes of the cameras were blinding, popping like miniature suns. Daniel felt Claire's hand slip into his. It was ice cold and trembling. He squeezed it gently, a firm pulse of reality. "Just walk, Claire, I'm right here." Don't look at the lights, look at the door. One step at a time." The entrance was a gauntlet of whispers. "Who is he? Is that the fiancé? He looks different than the photos from the engagement party." Inside the ballroom, the air was thick with the scent of $500 perfume and the predatory energy of 100 investors looking for a weakness. As they moved through the crowd, Daniel realized his role wasn't just to stand there. He was a barrier. He stayed half a step behind her, his presence a quiet warning to the men who tried to corner her with aggressive questions. When a rival CEO, a man named Marcus who had been trying to hostilely take over the firm, tried to needle her about a recent merger delay, Daniel simply stepped forward. He handed Marcus a fresh drink and redirected the conversation with a single, sharp observation about European market trends that he had read at breakfast. Claire watched him out of the corner of her eye. She was stunned. He wasn't faking it. He wasn't trying to be someone. He was just being Daniel, calm, observant, and entirely unimpressed by the glitter of the room. His lack of ego was his greatest strength. It made the sharks hesitate. They couldn't find a hook in him. During a quiet moment near the balcony, away from the prying eyes, Claire leaned against the stone railing. The city lights of New York stretched out below them like a carpet of diamonds. "How are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice finally dropping the corporate mask. "You're handling these people better than my senior VPs." "Because I don't want anything from them," Daniel replied, looking out at the skyline. "Most people in this room are trying to win something. I'm just here to make sure you get through the night without falling. When you don't need to win, you can see the game for exactly what it is. A bunch of people afraid of being ordinary." He looked at her, his expression softening in the moonlight. "You know, I've seen you in the meetings for 4 years. You always talk about the Donovan vision, but tonight I saw Claire, and I think the board would be a lot more loyal to her than they are to the vision if they actually knew her." Claire was silent for a long time. The jazz music from the ballroom drifted out to them, a soft, melancholy backdrop to her thoughts. "I forgot she existed, Daniel. I thought she was a liability. My father? He taught me that feelings were like leaks in a high-pressure pipe. You have to seal them immediately or the whole system fails." "Your father was wrong about pipes," Daniel said firmly. "If a pipe doesn't have a pressure valve, it eventually explodes." That's what happened in the boardroom this morning. You didn't fail, Claire. You just reached your limit. Even the strongest machines need maintenance. She looked at him, and for a second, the vast distance between the CEO and the manager vanished. They were just two people on a balcony, hiding from a world that demanded they be perfect. Claire felt a warmth she hadn't felt in years, a sense of safety that didn't come from a security detail. "Why didn't you ever try to move up, Daniel?" she asked. "You have the mind for it. You have the poise. You could be a director by now." "I had that life once," Daniel said, his voice echoing with a distant, resolved pain. "I was the guy in the tuxedo every night. I was the one chasing the billion-dollar deal until my eyes bled. And then Sarah got sick. I realized that all the poise in the world couldn't buy me one more minute of her time. I realized that my true value wasn't in a boardroom. It was in being the person Emma sees when she wakes up. I didn't stop being ambitious, Claire. I just changed what I was ambitious for." The realization hit Claire like a physical blow. She had spent years looking for the best talent, but she had ignored the man with the most integrity because he didn't fit her father's definition of success. She had been looking for more sharks, but what she actually needed was an anchor. The clock on the nearby church tower struck 9:30 p.m. "We should get back in," Daniel said. "You have a speech to give, and I have a movie to catch." Claire stood up straight, smoothing her emerald dress. She looked at Daniel, her eyes clear and steady for the first time. "Thank you for everything." "Don't thank me yet," he smiled. "You still have to deal with the lead investor. He's been staring at us from the bar for 20 minutes. He looks like he's calculating our net worth." "Let him calculate," Claire said, a genuine, powerful confidence returning to her voice. "He's about to see the best speech of my career, and he has you to thank for it." The speech was a triumph. Claire didn't deliver the usual dry, rehearsed script about profit margins. She spoke about resilience. She spoke about the human element behind the tech. She even shared a small anecdote about a maintenance lesson she had learned that morning. The room was captivated. For the first time, the investors didn't just see a CEO. They saw a leader they could actually follow. Daniel stood at the back of the room, leaning against a pillar. He watched her command the stage. He saw the way she looked at him once during the climax of her speech, a silent acknowledgement that only the two of them understood. After the applause died down, the lead investor, a man named Henderson, who was notoriously difficult to please, approached them. He looked at Daniel with a piercing curiosity. "Mr. Brooks, isn't it? I've been trying to place your face all night. Which firm are you with?" Daniel didn't flinch. "I'm with Donovan Tech, Mr. Henderson. I manage the product development logistics." Henderson's eyebrows shot up. "A manager? Claire, I thought you said he was—" "Well, you didn't say." Claire stepped forward, placing a hand on Daniel's arm. Her touch was warm now, and her voice was full of a quiet, undeniable pride. "Daniel is one of the people who keeps this company running, Arthur. He's the person I trust to see the things I miss. He's the most important person in the room tonight." Henderson looked between the two of them. He saw the way Claire stood, no longer a rigid statue, but a woman who was grounded. He nodded slowly, a look of genuine respect appearing on his face. "Well, Mr. Brooks, it seems I should be paying more attention to the managers. Good evening to you both." As Henderson walked away, Daniel checked his watch. 9:58 p.m. "You did it," Daniel said, looking at Claire. "The stocks will be up 5 points by the morning." "I don't care about the stocks tonight," Claire whispered. "I just care that I didn't have to do it alone." The ride back was quiet. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by a soft, comfortable exhaustion. When the car pulled up to Daniel's apartment, he turned to her. "The tuxedo is in the bag," he said. "I'll have it sent back to your office tomorrow." Claire reached out and caught his hand. "Daniel, you don't have to go back to being the invisible manager. I'm restructuring the executive board. I need a chief of operations, someone who knows how to listen." Daniel shook his head slowly, his eyes kind. "I appreciate the offer, Claire. Truly. But my daughter is waking up in 7 hours, and she needs her dad to be her dad, not a COO. My schedule is my most valuable asset. I can't sell it, not even to you." Claire looked at the small brick building. She looked at the man who had walked into her nightmare and turned it into a victory. She realized that she couldn't buy him, and she couldn't command him. She could only respect him. "I understand," she said softly, "but the offer for a permanent seat at the table, it stays open, no matter what." Daniel nodded. "I'll see you at the review meeting tomorrow, Claire. Don't be late. I have the data ready." He stepped out of the car and into the cool night air. He didn't look back. He walked up the stairs of his building, shedding the tuxedo jacket as he went. He was no longer the date of the billionaire CEO. He was just Daniel. Inside the apartment, the silence was beautiful. He walked into Emma's room, adjusted her blanket, and kissed her forehead. He sat on the sofa, pulled out a book, and finally, he breathed. The next morning, the office was buzzing. The news of the gala's success had preceded Claire's arrival. The Iron Queen walked through the lobby with her head held high. She looked the same as she always did, sharp, professional, and powerful. But as she passed the reception desk, she did something no one had seen her do in years. She smiled and said, "Good morning, Elena." In the product development department, Daniel was already at his desk. He was wearing his usual simple shirt. He was reviewing a logistics map. To anyone walking by, he was just a mid-level manager doing his job. When it was time for the morning briefing, Daniel walked into the boardroom. The usual group of VPs and directors were already there, jockeying for position and talking over each other. The door opened and Claire Donovan walked in. The room went silent. She walked to the head of the table, but before she opened her laptop, her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Daniel in the back. "Good morning, Daniel," she said. The silence that followed was absolute. The VPs looked at each other in shock. In 4 years, Claire had never addressed a manager by their first in name in a formal meeting. She had never acknowledged anyone below the level of director with such a clear tone of respect. "Good morning, Claire," Daniel replied, his voice calm and steady. The meeting proceeded, but the dynamic had shifted. When Daniel spoke, the VPs didn't try to interrupt him. They watched the CEO and they saw her listening to him with an intensity that demanded they do the same. He wasn't the nobody anymore. He was the person with the most valuable answer. Later that afternoon, a small package arrived at Daniel's desk. Inside was a handwritten note and a high-end Lego set, the one Emma had been asking for. To Emma, "Your dad tells me you're an architect in training. Keep building." To Daniel, "Thank you for reminding me that even machines need a pressure valve. See you at 5. Daniel smiled and tucked the note into his pocket. He finished his work, sent his final emails, and at exactly 5:01 p.m., he closed his laptop. As he walked toward the elevators, he passed Claire's office. She was standing by the window, her back to him. She didn't turn around, but she knew he was there. The world didn't change overnight. Claire was still the CEO, and Daniel was still a manager. But the Ice Queen was starting to melt, and the invisible dad was finally being seen. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person needs isn't a promotion or a headline. Sometimes they just need a person to stand next to them when they don't want to stand alone. True strength isn't about how much you can control, it's about how much you're willing to care. Daniel Brooks walked out of the building and into the golden light of the city. He had a movie to watch, a daughter to hug, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like the richest man in the world. If you believe that kindness and quiet support can change someone's hardest day, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been there for someone when they needed it most? How did it change your perspective?